The dust kicked up around Teresa Everhart's worn boots as she stumbled into Enid, Oklahoma territory, barely able to keep herself upright after 3 days of walking through the unforgiving August heat of 1892. She carried nothing but the threadbare dress on her back and memories she wished she could forget, each one heavy as stones in her chest. Behind her lay a husband's grave and a homestead reduced to ash by a prairie fire that had swept through so fast she'd barely escaped with her life. The town stretched before her like a mirage, all wooden storefronts and dusty streets, and she wondered if anyone would even notice when she finally collapsed. Ethan Irving watched from the porch of the general store as the woman swayed on her feet, recognition flickering through him even though he'd never seen her before in his life. Something about the way she held herself, proud despite the obvious exhaustion, called to a part of him he'd thought died along with his dreams of a family. He was 32 years old, owner of the second-largest cattle ranch in the territory, and he'd built everything from nothing after arriving in Enid 5 years ago with just a horse and determination. Yet watching this stranger struggle to take another step forward made his chest tighten in a way 1,000 head of cattle never had. She went down hard, knees buckling, and Ethan was moving before conscious thought took over. His long legs covered the distance in seconds, and he caught her just before her head hit the packed earth of Main Street. Up close, he could see the toll the journey had taken. Her dark brown hair, probably once carefully pinned, hung in tangled waves around a face smudged with dust and streaked with dried tears. Her lips were cracked from dehydration, and her green eyes, when they fluttered open briefly, held a depth of sorrow that made his breath catch. "I have got you," he said quietly, lifting her easily despite his own surprise at how light she was. Too light. "Dr. Morrison is just up the street." She tried to speak, her lips forming words he couldn't quite hear. He bent closer, and this time he caught the whisper. "Nobody will remember me anyway." The words struck him oddly, settling into his bones like a promise he hadn't made yet. He carried her to the doctor's office, shouldering through the door with more force than necessary. Dr. Morrison, a gray-haired man with kind eyes and steady hands, looked up from his desk and immediately gestured toward the examination room. "Found her on Main Street," Ethan explained, laying her gently on the narrow bed. "Looks like she has been traveling hard." The doctor began his examination, and Ethan knew he should leave, should return to the ranch where his foreman Charlie was waiting with questions about the fall roundup. Instead, he found himself rooted to the spot, unable to tear his eyes away from the woman's face as the doctor worked to revive her with water and smelling salts. Her eyes opened fully this time, confusion clouding them before fear took over. She tried to sit up, panic evident in every jerky movement. "Easy now," Dr. Morrison said gently. "You are safe. This is my office in Enid. You fainted on the street and Mr. Irving here brought you in." Teresa's gaze found Ethan, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. He saw her take in his sun-weathered face, the small scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood accident, the way his dark blonde hair needed a trim. She noted his clean shirt and good boots, the marks of a man who'd found success in this harsh land. What he saw in her eyes was harder to name, something raw and wounded and determined all at once. "I cannot pay," she said, her voice hoarse. "I have nothing." "Nobody asked you to pay," Ethan heard himself say. The words came out rougher than he intended, and he cleared his throat. "When did you last eat?" She had to think about it, which told him everything. "Day before yesterday, maybe. There was a farmhouse. The woman gave me bread." Dr. Morrison shook his head. "Severe dehydration and exhaustion." She needs rest, food, and at least a week of recovery before she should even think about traveling. I will take care of it, Ethan said. Both Teresa and the doctor turned to look at him in surprise. Hell, he was surprising himself. But the words had been said, and he'd never been a man to go back on his word. Mr. Irving, you do not even know me, Teresa protested, struggling to sit up despite the doctor's restraining hand. I cannot accept charity from a stranger. Then we will get acquainted, Ethan replied. Enid is not so big that newcomers can afford to be standoffish. And it is not charity. My housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, has been after me to hire help. You can work off your debt once you are back on your feet. It was a lie, and they both probably knew it, but it gave her pride an out. He watched her consider it, saw the moment she realized she had no other choice. The defeat in her eyes made him want to promise her things he had no business promising. Just until I recover, she finally agreed. Then I will move on. That phrase, move on, struck him wrong. He wondered what she was moving on from, but the shadows in her eyes told him not to ask. Not yet. Dr. Morrison kept her for observation the rest of that afternoon while Ethan made arrangements. He stopped by the boarding house run by Martha Sinclair, a formidable widow with a heart bigger than her considerable bulk, and secured a room. Then he headed to the general store and found himself staring at the women's section with the same confusion he'd feel looking at a technical drawing in Chinese. Need help, Ethan? Sarah Denton, the store owner's daughter, appeared at his elbow with an amused smile. She was 23, pretty, and had made it clear more than once that she'd welcome his courtship. He'd always been kind but firm in his disinterest. A woman arrived in town today, he explained, keeping his voice neutral. Needs some things. Clothes, toiletries, whatever else might be necessary. Sarah's expression cooled slightly. What kind of woman arrives in town with nothing? The kind who has been through hard times, Ethan said, his tone making it clear the subject was not open for gossip. Can you help or not? She could, though her movements were brisk as she gathered items. A simple calico dress in blue that Ethan thought might match Teresa's eyes. A nightgown. Undergarments that made him look away, feeling intrusive. A brush, soap, tooth powder. By the time she finished, he had quite a pile and a significant dent in his pocket money. He brought everything to the boarding house, arranging it in the small but clean room Martha showed him. The older woman watched him with knowing eyes that made him uncomfortable. Awfully generous for a stranger, she observed. Christian duty, Ethan replied. MMHMM. Martha did not look convinced. This Christian duty have a name. Teresa Everhart, he said, then wondered how he'd known her last name. She must have told the doctor. And where's Mr. Everhart? Dead, I would imagine, given the morning dress. Ethan realized he was being shorter than Martha deserved. He softened his tone. She has had a rough time, Martha. Town like Enid, we take care of our own. She is not our own yet, Martha pointed out, but her eyes were kind. But she will be, if you have anything to say about it. Ethan did not dignify that with a response. He headed back to Dr. Morrison's office as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Inside, he found Teresa sitting up, looking slightly better with water and rest. The doctor had given her some broth and color had returned to her cheeks. Ready to see your accommodations? Ethan asked from the doorway. She nodded, moving slowly as she stood. The doctor had wrapped one of her ankles, which Ethan noticed was swollen. When she tried to walk, she winced. Twisted it yesterday, she admitted. I did not think it was this bad. Without asking permission, Ethan scooped her up again. She stiffened in his arms, and he could feel her reluctance to accept more help. But practicality won over pride, and she allowed him to carry her the 2 blocks to Martha's boarding house. I can walk tomorrow, she insisted as he navigated the stairs to the second floor. "This is unnecessary." "Maybe," he agreed, "but today it is necessary." He set her down in the room, watching as she took in the simple furnishings. The bed with its patchwork quilt, the small dresser and washstand, the window overlooking Main Street. When her gaze landed on the pile of new things on the dresser, her face crumpled. "I said I cannot pay for this." "And I said you will work it off." Ethan leaned against the door frame, keeping his voice matter of fact. "Mrs. Chen really does need help. She is getting older and the ranch house is big. You will earn your keep." Teresa sat heavily on the bed, her hands twisting in her lap. "Why are you doing this?" It was a fair question. Ethan considered it, thinking about the moment he'd seen her standing in the street, about the way her whispered words had burrowed into his chest and made a home there. "Because 5 years ago, I arrived in this territory with nothing and nobody. A man named Joseph Crane gave me a chance, lent me money to buy my first 100 head of cattle when the bank would not look at me twice. He died 3 years ago, never saw the debt repaid because I was still building the herd. I made sure his widow never wanted for anything, but it is not the same. Maybe this is my chance to pass on what he gave me." It was the truth, but not the whole truth. The whole truth was something he did not quite understand himself yet. Teresa looked at him for a long moment, her green eyes searching his face. "You are a good man, Mr. Irving." "Ethan," he corrected. "And I am just a man. Get some rest. I will have Martha bring up supper. Tomorrow, if you are feeling stronger, I will take you out to the ranch so you can meet Mrs. Chen." He left before she could argue, before he could do something foolish like sit down beside her and ask her to tell him everything that had put that haunted look in her eyes. Outside, the evening air had cooled and he breathed deeply, trying to clear his head. "Ethan." Charlie Dawson, his foreman, rode up on his spotted mare, his weathered face creased with concern. "Been looking all over for you. We have got a problem with the fence line on the eastern pasture. Looks like someone cut through it deliberate-like. Business." "Right." He had a ranch to run, cattle to manage, real responsibilities that had nothing to do with green-eyed women who whispered about being forgotten. Ethan swung up onto his horse, which he'd tied outside the general store earlier, and followed Charlie out of town. But as they rode, he found his thoughts drifting back to Teresa. The way she felt in his arms, light as a sparrow but with a core of steel he could sense. The determination in her voice when she insisted she would pay her own way. The grief that clung to her like a shadow. "You listening?" Charlie's voice broke through his reverie. "Sorry, what?" His foreman gave him a long look. "I said it looks like Thomas Riker's work. He has been making noise about wanting to expand his holdings, and your eastern pasture would give him access to the creek." Thomas Riker. The man owned the largest ranch in the territory and had made it clear he thought Ethan was an upstart who'd gotten lucky. They'd clashed more than once over water rights and grazing lands. If Riker was escalating to sabotage, things were about to get complicated. They reached the fence line as the last light faded. Sure enough, 3 sections had been cut clean through and a dozen head of cattle had wandered onto Riker's land. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Round them up," he ordered, "and post men here tonight. If anyone comes back to cause more trouble, I want to know about it. You going to talk to the sheriff tomorrow?" Ethan turned his horse back toward the ranch house. "Right now, I need to think." The ranch house stood on a small rise, a sprawling structure he'd built piece by piece as his fortune grew. Mrs. Chen, a Chinese immigrant who'd worked for him since the 2nd year, had lights burning in the windows and supper waiting. She took one look at his face and poured him coffee without comment. "Something wrong, Mr. Irving." He told her about the fence, about Riker's likely involvement. Then, because he told Mrs. Chen most things, he told her about Teresa. The older woman listened, her dark eyes unreadable. She'd been through her own hardships, arriving in America after her husband died building the railroad, making her way with quiet dignity and fierce independence. Ethan respected her more than just about anyone he knew. "You like this woman," Mrs. Chen said when he finished. It was not a question. "I do not know her." Sometimes knowing is not required for liking. She refilled his coffee. "You want to help her. This is good, but be careful. Woman who whispers she will not be remembered, she is running from something. Maybe she is not ready to be found." The words haunted him as he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling. What was Teresa running from? Her husband's death, obviously, but there seemed to be more to it. The way she'd flinched when she first woke up. The defeat in her eyes when she said she had nothing. He thought about the moment he'd caught her, the way her whisper had struck him like a physical blow. "Nobody will remember me anyway." The words of someone who'd been forgotten before, dismissed or overlooked, until she'd started to believe she was forgettable. Well, he remembered. He remembered the exact shade of her eyes, green like new grass after rain. The way her hair fell in waves, dark as mahogany. The small scar on her chin, barely visible under the dust. The calluses on her hands that spoke of hard work. He remembered all of it, had somehow catalogued every detail in those brief moments of contact. Sleep came late and brought dreams of fence lines and green eyes tangled together in ways that made no sense. Morning arrived with Charlie pounding on his door at dawn. "Boss, we have got company." Thomas Riker himself, riding up the main road with half a dozen men. Ethan dressed quickly and met Riker in the yard. The man sat astride a black stallion, his expensive hat and custom saddle announcing his wealth. He was 10 years older than Ethan, with a face that might have been handsome if not for the perpetual sneer he wore. "Irving," Riker said by way of greeting. "You have cattle on my land." "You have cut fence on my land," Ethan countered. "The cattle wandered through. We will remove them today." "See that you do." Riker's gaze swept over the ranch house, the barns, the corrals. "Nice place you have built here. Shame if something happened to it." The threat hung in the air, ugly and unmistakable. Ethan felt his temper rise but kept his voice level. "That sounds like a threat, Riker." "In front of witnesses. Just an observation." Riker smiled, showing too many teeth. "This is hard country. Accidents happen, fires, stampedes, all sorts of unfortunate events." Before Ethan could respond, the sound of an approaching wagon drew everyone's attention. Martha Sinclair's rig came into view, and seated beside her was Teresa, looking stronger than yesterday but still pale. They must have been on their way to the ranch for Teresa to meet Mrs. Chen. Riker's eyes locked onto Teresa with an intensity that made Ethan want to step between them. "Well now," the older rancher drawled. "Who is this lovely creature?" "None of your concern," Ethan said flatly. But Teresa was staring at Riker with an expression Ethan could not quite read. Recognition, fear, her hands clenched in her lap, knuckles going white. "Mr. Riker," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Riker's grin widened. "You know me, darling. My husband worked for you 3 years ago before we filed our own claim, Daniel Everhart." The name seemed to mean nothing to Riker, which did not surprise Ethan. A man like that probably did not bother learning the names of his hired hands, but Teresa's face had gone chalk white, and Ethan moved to the wagon without thinking. "Martha was bringing Teresa out to meet Mrs. Chen," he said, offering his hand to help her down. "About that job I mentioned." Teresa took his hand, her fingers cold despite the morning warmth. As her feet touched the ground, she swayed slightly, and Ethan steadied her with a hand on her elbow. "Job." Riker's tone had gone sharp. "What kind of job?" "Housekeeper," Ethan replied. Not that it is any of your business. Everything in this territory is my business. Riker's gaze raked over Teresa again. If you are looking for work, Mrs. Everhart, I pay better than Irving here ever could. My house could use a woman's touch. The suggestion in his voice made Ethan's hands curl into fists. But Teresa surprised him by drawing herself up straight, meeting Riker's eyes directly. I have accepted Mr. Irving's offer, she said clearly. Thank you for your interest, but I am not looking for other employment. Something flickered across Riker's face, there and gone too quickly to identify. Anger, maybe, or surprise at being refused. He tipped his hat in a mockery of politeness. Your loss. Remember what I said, Irving. Remove your cattle from my land by sundown. He wheeled his horse and rode off, his men trailing behind. The tension in the yard dissipated slowly, like smoke clearing after a fire. That man is trouble, Martha said flatly. Ethan, you watch yourself. Always do. He turned to Teresa, who was watching the dust cloud from Riker's departure. You knew your husband worked for him. For 6 months before we saved enough to file our claim. Her voice was distant. Daniel never spoke much about it. Said Riker was a hard man but paid on time. I met him once when I brought Daniel lunch. He looked at me like. She trailed off, shaking her head. It does not matter. That was 3 years ago. But it clearly did matter. Ethan could see it in the tension in her shoulders, the way her breath came a little too fast. Whatever had happened during that brief meeting had left an impression, and not a good one. Come on, he said gently. Let me introduce you to Mrs. Chen. Martha, thank you for bringing her out. The older woman nodded, though her eyes were worried. You be careful, she repeated. Both of you. Mrs. Chen took to Teresa immediately, which relieved Ethan more than he wanted to examine. The two women walked through the house together, Mrs. Chen explaining the household routine while Teresa listened and asked thoughtful questions. Ethan watched from the doorway of his study, pretending to review his account books while actually tracking Teresa's movements through the house. She paused in the front room, her fingers trailing over the spines of his books. You read poetry? Ethan looked up, surprised she'd noticed. The poetry volumes were relegated to the bottom shelf, a guilty pleasure he did not advertise. Some. Wordsworth mostly. My mother used to read it to me when I was young. She dwelt among the untrodden ways, Teresa quoted softly. A maid whom there were none to praise and very few to love. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Ethan found himself standing, moving toward her without conscious decision. I never liked that poem, he said. The idea that someone could live and die without being seen, without mattering, it always struck me as the saddest thing I could imagine. Teresa's eyes met his, and he saw the sheen of tears she was trying to hide. Sometimes that is just how life is. Some people are not meant to be remembered. That is not true. The words came out fierce, more intense than he intended. Everyone matters. Everyone leaves a mark, even if the world tries to pretend otherwise. You do not know that, she whispered. You do not know what it is like to be so thoroughly forgotten that you might as well have never existed. Ethan wanted to ask what she meant, wanted to understand the pain behind those words. But Mrs. Chen returned, breaking the moment, and Teresa turned away, brushing her eyes quickly. The women worked out a schedule, and it was agreed that Teresa would start the following Monday, giving her a few more days to recover. Ethan drove her back to town in his buckboard, the silence between them heavy with things unsaid. Your husband, he finally ventured as they neared Enid. How did he die? Teresa was quiet for so long he thought she would not answer. Then, the fire took him. He went back into the house to save our wedding photograph and some papers. The roof collapsed. Her voice was flat, emotionless, as if she drained herself of feeling to get through the telling. I tried to go after him, but a neighbor held me back. I watched it burn. Everything we'd built, everything we were, just turned to ash. I am sorry, Ethan said, knowing the words were inadequate. The worst part, she continued as if he had not spoken, was afterward. At the funeral, there were maybe 10 people, most of them his friends, not mine. And I realized that in the 5 years we were married, I had not made a life of my own. I had built everything around him, and when he was gone, there was nothing left. No one who would miss me if I disappeared. No mark I'd made on the world. Just Teresa, who was Daniel's wife, and now even that is gone. Her words from the day before suddenly made horrible sense. Nobody will remember me anyway. She'd meant it literally. She believed she'd lived 24 years without making any impression, without mattering to anyone. That is going to change, Ethan heard himself say. You are going to make a life here, Teresa. A real one. And people are going to remember you. She gave him a sad smile. You are kind to say so. I am not being kind, I am being truthful. He pulled the buckboard to a stop in front of the boarding house. You want to know what I remember about you? What? She looked skeptical. You have a small scar on your chin, maybe from when you were a child. Your eyes are green but with gold flecks near the center. You have calluses on your right palm from holding reins and tools, but your left hand is softer. You favor your right foot slightly, probably from that twisted ankle. You read poetry and can quote Wordsworth from memory, and when you talk about your husband, you do not cry. You have already cried yourself empty, and now you are just trying to survive. Teresa stared at him, her lips parted in surprise. You noticed all that? I notice everything about you, Ethan said simply, and I have only known you a day. She climbed down from the buckboard without help, though he could see her hands shaking. At the door, she turned back. Ethan, thank you for seeing me. He tipped his hat, not trusting his voice. As he drove back to the ranch, he wondered what he'd gotten himself into. He'd meant to help a stranger, to repay the kindness shown to him years ago. Instead, he found himself thinking about green eyes and sad smiles, and the way Teresa's voice caught when she talked about being forgotten. The next days passed in a blur of work. He dealt with the cattle that had strayed, filed a complaint with the sheriff about Riker's fence cutting, and tried to keep his mind on business. But every evening found him in town on some pretext or another, checking on Teresa's recovery. She was getting stronger. Martha fed her well, and the rest showed in the color returning to her cheeks, the steadiness in her step. She spent her days helping Martha around the boarding house, insisting on earning her keep even there. Ethan would find excuses to stop by, bringing fresh vegetables from Mrs. Chen's garden or books he thought Teresa might enjoy. They talked. About small things at first. The weather, the town gossip, his ranch. But gradually, the conversations deepened. Teresa told him about growing up in Missouri, the daughter of a struggling shopkeeper who died when she was 16. Her mother had passed 2 years later, leaving Teresa alone and unmoored. She'd married Daniel at 19, more out of need for security than love, though she'd come to care for him in time. Ethan shared his own story. Growing up in Kansas, the youngest of 6 children. His father's death in a farm accident when Ethan was 17. His decision to head west, to make something of himself instead of scratching out a living on played-out land. The lean years, the hard work, the slow building of a dream. Did you ever want to marry? Teresa asked one evening as they sat on Martha's porch, watching the sun set over the prairie. Once, Ethan admitted. Girl named Catherine. I was 23, thought I had the world figured out. She chose someone with better prospects. Her loss, Teresa said firmly, and the conviction in her voice made him smile. Maybe, or maybe I needed those years to build something worth having. You cannot raise a family on dreams and determination alone. But you have something worth having now, Teresa pointed out. A successful ranch, respect in the community. You could have your pick of women. Ethan looked at her, at the way the fading light caught in her hair and painted her skin gold. Maybe I am particular. Something passed between them, quick as lightning and just as electric. Teresa looked away first, her cheeks flushing. I should go in, she said, standing quickly. Martha will be wondering where I am. But she did not move, and Ethan found himself standing too, close enough to catch the scent of the lavender soap she'd used, close enough to see the pulse fluttering at her throat. Teresa, he began, not sure what he meant to say. The moment shattered as the sound of gunfire cracked through the evening air. Both of them froze. Then Ethan was moving, pushing Teresa behind him as he scanned the street. 3 shots, coming from the direction of the saloon. Not unusual in Enid, where cowboys still settled disputes with bullets, but his instincts were screaming danger. Sheriff Tom Hayward came running out of his office, gun drawn. More shots and then shouting. Ethan stayed where he was, keeping himself between Teresa and whatever trouble was brewing. After a few minutes, the sheriff returned, holstering his weapon. Just some cowboys getting rowdy, Hayward called to the people gathered on the street. Nothing to worry about. But when his eyes met Ethan's, there was concern there. Later, after Teresa went inside, Ethan cornered the sheriff. That was not just rowdy cowboys, he said flatly. Hayward sighed. No, it was some of Riker's men, drunk and making noise about how the territory is not big enough for both ranches. I threw them in a cell to cool off, but Ethan, you need to be careful. Riker is working himself up to something. Let him try, Ethan said, his voice hard. I am not backing down. I know you are not. That is what worries me. The sheriff clapped him on the shoulder. Just watch your back. Ethan rode home under a sky thick with stars, his mind churning. Riker's escalation was troubling, but more troubling was the way his first thought during the gunfire had been protecting Teresa. She'd been in his life less than a week, and already she'd become someone he'd step in front of a bullet for, Mrs. Chen was waiting up when he arrived, tea steeping on the kitchen table. The woman, she said without preamble, you have feelings for her. Maybe, Ethan admitted, too tired to dissemble. She has feelings for you too, I see it when she looks at you. She is grieving, Ethan protested. Her husband has been dead less than a month. It would not be right. Grief and love are not opposites, Mrs. Chen said wisely. The heart knows what it needs even when the mind is confused, but you are right to be careful. Give her time. Let her heal. Time. Right. Ethan could do that. He'd built a ranch from nothing through patience and persistence. He could surely manage patience with Teresa. Teresa started work at the ranch the following Monday, and Ethan quickly realized that having her in his home was going to be both the best and worst decision he'd ever made. Best because she brought a warmth to the place it had never had before. Fresh flowers on the table, curtains that actually matched, meals that were more than just functional. She and Mrs. Chen worked together seamlessly, often talking in the easy way women had when they'd found friendship. Worst because Ethan found himself hyper-aware of her presence every moment. The sound of her humming while she worked. The way she bit her lower lip when concentrating. How she'd pause to stare out the windows at the endless prairie, her expression distant and sad. He tried to keep his distance, to be professional and proper. But the house felt different with her in it. It felt like a home instead of just a place he slept between long days of work. And when she smiled at him over dinner, asking about his day with genuine interest, he felt something in his chest unlock. 2 weeks after Teresa arrived in Enid, Thomas Riker made his next move. Ethan was checking the water levels in the creek that formed the eastern boundary of his property when he heard cattle. Too many cattle, moving too fast. He spurred his horse toward the sound and crested a rise to see at least 50 head being driven straight toward his fence line. They hit the barbed wire at full gallop, the fence posts snapping like kindling. Cowboys wearing Riker's brand drove them through, whooping and hollering. Ethan recognized the tactic immediately. Stampede cattle through his fence, destroy his grazing land, and claim it was an accident if anyone asked. Fury burned through him, but he kept his head. Instead of confronting the cowboys directly, he watched from the rise, noting faces and counting cattle. Evidence for the sheriff. Then he rode hard for the ranch house, gathering his own men and sending a rider to town for Hayward. By the time he got back to the fence line, Riker's men were gone, leaving destruction in their wake. Trampled grass, broken fence, and worst of all, 3 of his cattle dead from getting tangled in the barbed wire. Charlie and the other hands were already trying to sort out the mess, separating Riker's cattle from their own. Sheriff Hayward arrived as the sun was setting, looking grim. "He is pushing," the lawman observed, "waiting for you to push back so he can claim self-defense when things turn violent." "I am not giving him the satisfaction," Ethan said, though his jaw ached from clenching. "But I want this documented. Damages, witnesses, everything. Already on it." Hayward pulled out a notebook. "But Ethan, documentation might not be enough if he decides to escalate to gunfire." The thought sent ice down Ethan's spine, not because he was afraid for himself, but because Teresa was living at the ranch now. If Riker's men came in shooting, she'd be in danger. As if summoned by his thoughts, he looked up to see Teresa running toward them across the field, her skirts hiked up and her hair flying loose. Mrs. Chen followed more slowly, her face creased with worry. "Ethan," Teresa called, breathless. "We heard riders. Are you hurt?" The concern in her voice, the fear in her eyes, struck him with the force of a physical blow. Without thinking, he caught her hands. "I am fine, just some property damage." She looked past him to the broken fence, the milling cattle, the grim faces of his men. This was deliberate. "Yes," he admitted. "Riker is trying to force me out." "Why?" Teresa's hands tightened on his. "Why would he do this?" "Because he wants what I have. Land, water, the success I have built. Men like Riker think the territory should belong to whoever had the biggest ranch first." Ethan forced himself to release her hands, aware of the sheriff watching with interest. "But I am not going anywhere." Teresa looked at him for a long moment, her green eyes reflecting the dying light. "You are going to fight, if I have to. Then I am staying." At his questioning look, she continued, "I was going to ask for time off tomorrow to go into town, look for additional work. I thought maybe I should not impose on your hospitality indefinitely. But if there is trouble coming, you will need all the help you can get. Mrs. Chen and I can keep the household running. Let your men focus on the ranch. Teresa, if this turns dangerous, I would rather you were safe in town." "I am tired of running," she said fiercely. "I ran after the fire, ran from the memories, ran from the feeling that I did not matter. But here now I can be useful. I can help. Please do not send me away." Looking at her, Ethan understood something fundamental. She needed this. Needed to stand and fight instead of always fleeing. Needed to matter to someone, to something. And he needed her here, even if admitting it felt selfish. "All right," he agreed. "But you stay near the house. If shooting starts, you and Mrs. Chen get to the cellar." "We will bring extra ammunition," Teresa said with a small smile that did not hide the worry in her eyes. Over the next week, the situation stabilized into an uneasy tension. Riker made no more overt moves, but his men were always around, watching from just beyond Ethan's property lines. Ethan doubled the guard on his cattle and made sure someone was always near the house. At night, he lay awake listening to every sound, his rifle close at hand. Teresa handled it all with a calm competence that impressed him. She and Mrs. Chen prepared extra meals for the men pulling guard duty, kept the household running smoothly, and somehow maintained an atmosphere of normalcy despite the stress. More than once, Ethan found himself in the kitchen late at night, drawn by lamplight to find Teresa baking bread or mending clothes. They talked during those quiet hours. Really talked in a way he'd never talked to anyone. She told him about her marriage, the loneliness of it despite companionship. Daniel had been a good man but distant, more interested in his work than in understanding his wife. She'd spent 5 years trying to be enough for him, molding herself to his expectations, and in the process lost track of who she was. Ethan told her about the weight of building something from nothing, the constant pressure to prove himself worthy of the success he'd earned, the loneliness of being a man of property with no one to share it with, how he'd convinced himself he did not need companionship, that the work was enough. "But it is not enough, is it?" Teresa asked one night as they sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. "No," Ethan admitted. "It is not. I built something worth having, but there is no one to have it with me, no one to see what I have accomplished or care that I did it." "I see it," Teresa said softly. "I see what you have built, Ethan. It is impressive. You should be proud." "I am proud of the ranch," he replied. "But lately I have been wondering if I built it at the expense of everything else. Family, love, connection. The things that actually make life worth living." Teresa reached across the table, her hand covering his. The touch was simple, unassuming, but it sent warmth through his entire body. "It is not too late," she said. "You are only 32, you have time to build the rest." He turned his hand over, lacing his fingers through hers. "What about you? You are 24, young enough to start over, to make the life you want instead of the one you fell into." "I do not know what I want anymore," she confessed. "I thought I did once. A home, a family, security. But I had all that with Daniel, and it still felt empty. Like I was playing a role in someone else's story instead of living my own." "Then write your own story," Ethan said. "Figure out what you want and go after it. You are strong enough. These past weeks have proved that." Teresa's eyes shone with unshed tears. "You have more faith in me than I have in myself. Then borrow mine until you find your own." The moment stretched between them, heavy with possibility. Ethan wanted to kiss her, wanted it with an intensity that shook him. But it was too soon, she was too vulnerable, and he was not the kind of man who took advantage. So he simply held her hand and let the connection speak for itself. The sound of horses in the yard shattered the peace. Ethan was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, motioning for Teresa to get down. But before he could reach the window, Charlie's voice called out, "Boss, we have got a situation." Ethan rushed outside to find 3 of his cattle dead in the near pasture, their throats cut. Not killed by predators or accident. Murdered. "Found them like this on my rounds," Charlie said, his face grim in the lamplight. "This is a message." "What kind of message?" Teresa had followed despite Ethan's silent plea for her to stay inside. "The kind that says the next thing killed might be one of us," Charlie replied bluntly. Ethan felt cold fury settle in his gut. Riker had crossed a line. Property damage was one thing, but slaughtering cattle in the night was something else entirely. It was terrorism, plain and simple. "Round up everyone," he ordered. "I want every hand armed and on alert." And someone ride for the sheriff. But when Hayward arrived an hour later, he brought bad news. "Riker has 6 witnesses who will swear he was in town all night, playing cards at the saloon. I cannot touch him without proof he ordered this." "So what are we supposed to do?" Ethan demanded. "Wait until he actually kills someone. You could sell," Hayward said quietly. "Take your profits, buy land somewhere else, start over." "No." The word came from Teresa, fierce and uncompromising. You do not run from bullies. You stand up to them, show them you will not be intimidated. Both men looked at her in surprise. She stood straight, her chin lifted, and Ethan saw something he had not seen before: fire, determination. The woman she'd been before grief and loss had beaten her down. "She is right," Ethan said. "This is my land, my ranch. I have built something here, and I will not let Riker take it from me." Hayward sighed. "Then be ready for war, because that is where this is heading." The sheriff left, and Ethan organized watches through the rest of the night. He tried to convince Teresa to sleep, but she refused, staying up to keep coffee hot and food ready for the men rotating through. When dawn finally broke, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, she was still there beside him. "You should rest," Ethan said gently. "You have been up all night." "So have you," Teresa pointed out. "And I am fine. Stop trying to protect me from reality." "I am not trying to protect you from reality. I am trying to protect you from harm." The words came out more intense than he intended, revealing the depth of his concern. Teresa turned to face him fully, her eyes searching his face. "Why? Why do you care so much about what happens to me?" "Because I am falling in love with you," Ethan thought. "Because in 3 weeks, you have become more important to me than anything except maybe breathing. Because when I think about you getting hurt, something in my chest cracks open." But he could not say any of that. Not when she was still grieving, still finding her feet. So he settled for a truth that was safer if less complete. "Because you matter." "Because I see you, Teresa, really see you, and I understand what it costs you to stand here and fight instead of run. Because you are brave and kind and stronger than you know, and because this world needs people like you in it." Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she brushed at them impatiently. "You say the most impossibly wonderful things. I only say what is true." She moved then, closing the distance between them and wrapping her arms around him in a hug that felt like coming home. Ethan held her carefully, aware of the line he was walking. Aware that this could be simple comfort or the beginning of something profound. "Thank you," Teresa whispered against his chest. "For remembering me." "Always," Ethan replied, and meant it with everything he had. They stood like that as the sun climbed higher, holding each other while the ranch came to life around them. When they finally pulled apart, something had shifted between them. An understanding, an acknowledgement of feelings that were growing too big to ignore. The next attack came 3 days later. Fire this time in the hay barn. They caught it early, managed to save most of the structure, but the message was clear. Riker was escalating, getting bolder. Ethan called a meeting of the surrounding ranchers, hoping to rally support against Riker's aggression. To his surprise, Teresa asked to attend. "You want to sit in on a ranchers' meeting?" he asked, puzzled. "I have an idea," she said, "and I think it might help. Please trust me." So she sat beside him in his front room as 7 other ranchers gathered, listening as Ethan laid out the situation. Most were sympathetic but reluctant to get involved. Riker was powerful, and crossing him could mean becoming his next target. Then Teresa spoke. "Gentlemen, I know I am new to this territory, and I have no right to speak at a gathering like this, but please hear me out." She waited until she had their full attention. "I was married to a man who worked for Thomas Riker. My husband never spoke much about it, but I saw the fear in his eyes when the subject came up. Riker rules through intimidation, making everyone too afraid to stand against him. But what if you all stood together? 1 ranch he can destroy. 7 ranches united present a different problem entirely." "She has a point," said Marcus Freeman, who owned land to the north. "We have all had trouble with Riker at one point or another. Stolen cattle, cut fences, threats. But we have handled it individually, never as a group." "You are suggesting we form some kind of alliance?" asked another rancher. I am suggesting you stop letting fear dictate your choices, Teresa said firmly. Every time one of you backs down, Riker gets stronger. Eventually, he will come for all of you. Better to stop him now together than face him alone later. The men looked at each other, considering. Slowly, one by one, they began to nod. By the time the meeting ended, they had formed a pact. An injury to one would be treated as an injury to all. They would share information, resources, and if necessary, men to defend each other's property. After everyone left, Ethan pulled Teresa aside. "That was brilliant," he said simply. She ducked her head, embarrassed. "I just said what seemed logical." "No, you did more than that. You gave them courage. You reminded them that they do not have to face threats alone." He touched her chin gently, tilting her face up to meet his eyes. "You are remarkable, Teresa Everhart." The air between them crackled with tension. Ethan saw the moment her pupils dilated, her breath catching. He was going to kiss her. Should not, but was going to anyway, because keeping his distance was becoming impossible. "Mrs. Chen's voice from the doorway stopped him. "Mr. Irving, there are riders coming. Many riders." The moment shattered. Ethan grabbed his rifle and rushed outside, Teresa right behind him. A dust cloud on the horizon resolved into at least 20 mounted men. As they got closer, Ethan recognized the lead rider. Thomas Riker had come calling with an army. Ethan's men scrambled to defensive positions as Riker and his hands surrounded the ranch house. The rancher sat his black stallion with arrogant ease, a slight smile playing on his lips. "Irving," Riker called, "we need to talk." "Then talk," Ethan replied, his rifle held loosely but ready. "Say what you came to say and get off my land, always so hostile." Riker's smile widened. "I am here to make you an offer, one last chance to avoid unpleasantness. I will buy your ranch for a fair price. You take the money, go somewhere else, and we all walk away happy." "I am not selling." "Then you are a fool." Riker's gaze slid past Ethan to Teresa, who stood on the porch behind him. "Although I admit I understand the appeal of staying. That is a pretty woman you have there. It would be a shame if she got caught in the crossfire when things turn violent." Ethan felt rage surge through him, white-hot and barely controlled. "If you threaten her again, there will not be enough of you left to bury." "Touched a nerve, did I?" Riker laughed. "Interesting. Tell me, Mrs. Everhart, does Irving know that your late husband owed me money when he died? $300 he borrowed and never repaid. I could argue that debt passes to you." Teresa's face went pale. "Daniel never mentioned a debt." "Men rarely tell their wives everything, but I have the papers, signed and witnessed. So perhaps instead of working for Irving, you should be working for me to pay off what is owed." "That debt died with Daniel," Ethan said flatly. "You have no legal claim on Teresa." "Oh, I think a judge might see it differently." Riker's expression was predatory. "Unless, of course, we can come to an arrangement. You sell me the ranch and I will forgive the debt. Everyone wins." Ethan saw the trap immediately. If Teresa truly owed Riker money, the man could tie her up in legal proceedings for years, make her life a misery. It was a pressure point, a vulnerability Riker would exploit ruthlessly. "What do you say, Irving? Is your stubborn pride worth ruining this woman's life?" Before Ethan could respond, Teresa stepped forward. "I have a counter-proposal, Mr. Riker. Take your fake debt and your threats and leave this ranch. Because unlike my late husband, I am not afraid of you. And unlike every other person you have bullied, I am not impressed by your show of force." Riker's smile vanished. "You should watch your tongue, woman. Or what? You will add more to a debt that does not exist. You will threaten me the way you threatened Ethan." Teresa's voice rang with conviction. "I have already lost everything once. You hold no power over me because there is nothing left for you to take. But Ethan has 7 neighboring ranchers who just agreed to stand with him against you. So your options are to leave peacefully or start a war you cannot win." The silence that followed was absolute. Ethan could not believe what he was hearing. Teresa, the woman who'd whispered that nobody would remember her, was staring down the most powerful man in the territory without flinching. Riker's face had gone red with fury. "You will regret this," he spat. "The only thing I regret is that my husband ever worked for a man like you." Teresa shot back. For a moment, Ethan thought Riker might do something reckless. The rancher's hand moved toward his gun, and Ethan raised his rifle. But Riker caught himself, looking around at the armed men watching from every angle. If he drew, he might get Teresa or Ethan, but he would not make it off the property alive. "This is not over," Riker snarled. "Yes, it is," Ethan said firmly. "You have shown your hand, Riker. You have no legal claim on Teresa. The debt you mentioned, even if it existed, is not enforceable against a widow. Any judge would laugh you out of court. You came here to intimidate us, and it did not work. Now leave before I have the sheriff arrest you for trespassing and threatening behavior." For a long moment, Riker just stared at them. Then he wheeled his horse and spurred it into a gallop. His men followed, leaving nothing but dust in their wake. As soon as they were out of sight, Ethan turned to Teresa. "That was either the bravest or most foolish thing I have ever seen." "Maybe both," she admitted, and he could see she was shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. "But I meant what I said. I am tired of being afraid, tired of letting men like Riker dictate my life." Ethan pulled her into his arms, not caring who saw. "You were magnificent," he murmured into her hair. "Absolutely magnificent." Teresa clung to him, her fingers digging into his shirt. "Was I? Because now I feel like I might throw up." He laughed, the sound surprising him. Here they were, having just faced down a man who wanted to destroy them, and he was laughing. But Teresa did that to him, made even the darkest moments somehow bearable. "Come inside," he said gently. "Mrs. Chen will make tea and we will figure out what comes next." What came next was surprising. Over the following week, word spread about Teresa's confrontation with Riker. The story grew in the telling, as stories do, until it seemed she'd single-handedly driven off an army. Women in town began seeking her out, asking for her company. Suddenly, she was not just Teresa, the widow nobody knew. She was Teresa Everhart, the woman who stood up to Thomas Riker. She was being remembered. Ethan watched her bloom under the attention, saw her gain confidence and purpose. She still worked at the ranch, but now she also helped organize a women's auxiliary group that provided support for families in need. She taught reading to children whose parents were too busy to educate them. She became part of the community in a way she'd never been anywhere else. And Ethan fell more in love with her every day. He tried to be patient, to give her space to grieve and heal. But it was getting harder to hide his feelings, especially during the quiet evenings when they found themselves alone. The way she looked at him, the small touches that lingered just a moment too long, suggested she might be feeling the same pull he was. Finally, 6 weeks after Teresa arrived in Enid, Ethan decided he could not wait any longer. He rode into town and bought a bouquet of flowers from the general store, ignoring Sarah Denton's raised eyebrows. Then he drove out to the ranch in the late afternoon, his heart pounding like he was some green kid instead of a grown man. He found Teresa in the garden behind the house, picking vegetables for dinner. The evening sun turned her hair to burnished gold and painted her dress in shades of amber. She looked up as he approached, a smile lighting her face. "You are home early," she said. "Is everything all right?" "Everything is perfect," Ethan replied. "I wanted to talk to you, alone if that is all right." Something in his tone made her set down her basket. "Of course. What is it?" He held out the flowers, suddenly feeling foolish. "These are for you." Teresa took them, her eyes widening. "They are beautiful, but Ethan, what is this about?" "It is about 6 weeks," he said. 6 weeks ago you walked into my life and everything changed. You changed it, Teresa. You took a house and made it a home. You took a lonely man and gave him something to hope for. You are brave and kind and so much stronger than you give yourself credit for, and I—" He paused, gathering courage. "I am in love with you." Teresa's breath caught, the flowers trembling in her hands. "Ethan." "I know it is soon," he continued, the words tumbling out now that he'd started. "I know you are still grieving and I do not want to pressure you, but I could not keep pretending I do not feel what I feel. You matter to me, Teresa. More than the ranch, more than my pride, more than anything. I see you, really see you, and I remember everything about you. The way you hum when you work, how you bite your lip when you are thinking, the fact that you take your coffee with 2 sugars and a splash of cream. I remember it all because you are impossible to forget." Tears were streaming down her face now. "You are making me cry. Good tears, I hope. The best tears." She set the flowers down carefully and moved toward him. "Ethan, I do not know how this happened. 6 weeks ago I was so lost I did not think I would ever find my way back. I thought I was forgettable, invisible, someone who would pass through life without leaving a mark. But you saw me. From the very first moment you saw me." "You are impossible not to see," Ethan said, reaching for her hands. "I have been so afraid," Teresa admitted. "Afraid that what I feel for you is just gratitude or a reaction to everything I have been through, but it is not. I know it is not because my heart knows the difference. When you walk into a room, everything gets brighter. When you smile at me, I feel like I could do anything. And when you are not here, I spend the whole time waiting for you to come back." "Is that a yes?" Ethan asked, hardly daring to hope. "To what? You have not asked a question yet," he laughed, giddy with relief and joy. "Teresa Everhart, I love you. I want to build a life with you, a real life with a future. I want to wake up beside you every morning and fall asleep holding you every night. I want to remember every moment we have together and make new memories until we are old and gray. Will you let me? Will you give us a chance?" "Yes," Teresa whispered. "Yes, I will give us a chance. I will build a life with you. I will make memories and be seen and be remembered. But Ethan, most importantly, I will love you. I already do." He kissed her then, finally, after weeks of restraint. Her lips were soft under his, tasting of tears and hope and the promise of everything to come. She kissed him back with a passion that surprised them both, her hands fisting in his shirt to pull him closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. "I want to marry you," he said. "Properly court you first, do this right, but Teresa, I want you to be my wife." "Then ask me again in a month," Teresa replied, smiling through her tears. "Give me time to be sure this is real and not just a beautiful dream, and then I will say yes with my whole heart." A month. He could wait a month. He'd already waited most of his life to find her. What was 30 more days? Those 30 days passed in a blur of happiness Ethan had never imagined possible. He courted Teresa properly, with flowers and picnics and long walks across the prairie. He introduced her to every part of his life, shared every dream and fear and hope. They talked about everything: children, the future, how to blend their lives together. Teresa moved back into town during the courtship, insisting they do things properly. But she spent most days at the ranch, working alongside Mrs. Chen and filling the house with laughter. She met all of Ethan's neighbors, who welcomed her warmly. She became friends with Martha and even won over the initially suspicious Sarah Denton at the general store. Riker, surprisingly, stayed quiet. There were no more attacks, no more threats. Sheriff Hayward thought the unified front of the ranchers had convinced him to back off, at least for now. Ethan remained cautious, but for the first time in months he felt like he could breathe. The proposal came on a crisp October evening, exactly 1 month after their first kiss. Ethan took Teresa to the highest point on his property, where you could see for miles in every direction. The sun was setting, painting the sky in impossible colors, and the prairie grass waved like a golden ocean. "This is where I stood 5 years ago," Ethan said, his arm around Teresa's waist. "The day I bought this land. I looked out at all this emptiness and tried to imagine what it could become. A home, a legacy, something that would matter. You did it," Teresa said softly. "You built something amazing." "I built buildings and gathered cattle," Ethan corrected. "But I did not build a home until you arrived. You are what makes it matter, Teresa. You are my legacy, my future, everything I want." He turned to face her fully, pulling a ring from his pocket. It was simple, a gold band with a small diamond, but he'd chosen it carefully. "Marry me, make this official. Let me spend the rest of my life remembering everything about you." Teresa's eyes shone with tears as she nodded. "Yes, yes, I will marry you, Ethan Irving. I will be your wife and build a home with you and love you for the rest of our lives." He slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly. Then he kissed her as the sun set behind them, sealing the promise. They were married 6 weeks later, in November of 1892, in a ceremony at the small church in Enid. The whole town turned out, along with ranchers from across the territory. Even Sheriff Hayward stood up as a witness, beaming with pride. Mrs. Chen cried, which surprised everyone, including herself. Teresa wore a simple white dress, altered from one Martha had in storage. But to Ethan, she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. When she walked down the aisle toward him, her face glowing with happiness, he felt his throat tighten with emotion. The Reverend spoke about love and commitment, about building a life together through good times and bad. But Ethan barely heard him. He was too busy looking at Teresa, at the woman who'd stumbled into his life broken and lost and somehow become his entire world. "I love you," he mouthed when she caught his eye, and her smile widened. "I love you too," she mouthed back. When the Reverend finally pronounced them husband and wife, Ethan kissed her with all the love and promise and joy he felt. The congregation erupted in applause, and for a moment, he let himself just exist in the perfection of it. The reception was held at the ranch, with tables set up in the yard and food enough to feed an army. People danced and laughed and celebrated late into the night. At one point, Marcus Freeman pulled Ethan aside. "You did good, Irving," the older rancher said. "That woman is something special." "I know," Ethan replied, watching Teresa laugh at something Mrs. Chen said. "Believe me, I know." "Riker did not show," Marcus observed. "That worry you a little," Ethan admitted. "But not enough to ruin today. Whatever comes, Teresa and I will face it together." As if summoned by mention of his name, Thomas Riker appeared at the edge of the yard. He was alone this time, sitting his black stallion and watching the celebration with an unreadable expression. Ethan tensed, ready for trouble, but Riker just sat there for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, he tipped his hat in acknowledgement before riding away. "What was that about?" Teresa asked, appearing at Ethan's side. "I think that was surrender," Ethan said slowly. "Or as close to it as a man like Riker gets. We won, Teresa. We stood our ground and we won." She leaned into him, her head on his shoulder. "We did we not? We both won." The dancing continued until after midnight, when finally the last guests departed with cheerful goodbyes and ribald jokes. Ethan and Teresa stood on the porch, waving until the final wagon disappeared down the road. "Alone at last," Ethan murmured, pulling his wife close. His wife, He'd never get tired of thinking that. "What now?" Teresa asked, a playful note in her voice. "Now," Ethan said, sweeping her into his arms despite her laughing protest, "I carry you over the threshold of our home and we start our life together." He carried her inside, kicking the door closed behind them. The house was quiet, Mrs. Chen having tactfully retired to her own rooms. Ethan set Teresa down gently in their bedroom, the one they would now share. "Nervous?" he asked, seeing her hands shake slightly as she began unpinning her hair. "A little," she admitted. "My marriage to Daniel was never like this. It always felt like I was going through motions, doing what was expected. But with you, everything feels new. Important." Ethan moved behind her, helping with the pins. Her hair fell in waves down her back, and he ran his fingers through it gently. "We have the rest of our lives to figure this out," he said. "No rushing, no pressure, just you and me building something real." Teresa turned in his arms, her eyes soft. "I love you, Ethan. I love you so much it scares me sometimes. After Daniel died, I thought I would never feel this way about anyone. But you made me feel seen and valued and remembered. You gave me back myself." "You gave me something too," Ethan replied. "Purpose beyond work. A reason to come home. You showed me what it means to build a life, not just a business." They came together then, all tenderness and passion and the promise of forever. And later, lying in the darkness with Teresa curled against his side, Ethan thought about the journey that had brought them here. 6 months ago, he'd been a successful rancher with an empty house. Teresa had been a grieving widow convinced she was forgettable. Now they were husband and wife, partners in every sense. They'd built something real from the ashes of their separate losses, found love when neither was looking for it. "What are you thinking?" Teresa murmured sleepily. "That I remember everything," Ethan replied. "Every moment since you walked into my life. And I am looking forward to spending the rest of my life making more memories with you." "Good," Teresa said, pressing a kiss to his chest. "Because you are stuck with me now, Ethan Irving. For better or worse, you are stuck with me." "Best deal I ever made," he replied, and meant it with everything he had. The first year of their marriage passed in a haze of happiness and hard work. They fell into a rhythm together, learning each other's habits and quirks. Teresa took over much of the household management, freeing Mrs. Chen to focus on the cooking she loved. The ranch continued to prosper, with Ethan expanding his herd and even buying additional land when a neighbor decided to move east. Riker stayed quiet, focusing on his own holdings. There were rumors he'd taken a financial hit from some bad investments, which explained his attempt to acquire Ethan's land cheaply. Whatever the reason, the threat seemed to have passed. In the spring of 1893, Teresa discovered she was pregnant. She told Ethan one evening over dinner, her face glowing with excitement and nervousness. "A baby," Ethan repeated, hardly able to process the words. "We are going to have a baby in October, the doctor thinks," Teresa confirmed. "Are you happy?" Happy did not begin to cover it. Ethan pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "I am beyond happy. I am terrified and thrilled and already planning how to keep this child safe from everything that could possibly go wrong." Teresa laughed, the sound pure joy. "We have months to prepare. But yes, I feel the same way. I never thought I would have this chance. Daniel and I tried for 5 years with no success. I had convinced myself I could not have children. And now you can," Ethan said, his hand moving to her still flat stomach. "Now we are going to be parents." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Ethan fretted over every little thing. He insisted Teresa rest more, worried when she was tired, panicked when she felt ill. She bore his concern with patient amusement, pointing out that women had been having babies since the beginning of time and she was hardly the first. but Ethan could not help himself. Teresa was his world, and the thought of anything happening to her or the baby kept him up at night. He read every book on pregnancy and childbirth he could find, much to the amusement of the general store staff. In October, right on schedule, Teresa went into labor. It was long and difficult, lasting nearly 20 hours. Ethan paced outside the bedroom door, ignored by the doctor and midwife who were focused entirely on Teresa. Every cry of pain she made went through him like a knife, making him feel helpless in a way he'd never experienced. Finally, just after dawn, the thin cry of a baby filled the house. Ethan burst through the door before anyone could stop him, rushing to Teresa's side. She looked exhausted, her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat, but she was smiling. "A boy," she said weakly. "We have a son." The doctor placed the baby in Ethan's arms, and he looked down at the tiny red face in wonder. His son. His and Teresa's. A perfect, healthy boy who already had his mother's nose and mouth. "What should we call him?" Ethan asked, his voice thick with emotion. "I was thinking Joseph," Teresa suggested. "After the man who gave you your start, Joseph Daniel Irving." Ethan nodded, unable to speak. He bent to kiss his wife's forehead, then looked back at his son. "Welcome to the world, Joseph," he whispered. "We are going to remember everything about you." The years that followed were full and rich. Joseph grew into a bright, curious boy who loved the ranch and everything on it. 2 years after his birth, Teresa gave birth to a daughter they named Catherine, after Ethan's mother. Then another boy, Samuel, 3 years after that. The ranch continued to prosper, becoming one of the most successful in the Oklahoma Territory. But more than that, it became a home filled with love and laughter. The house that had once echoed with emptiness now rang with children's voices and Teresa's singing, and the everyday sounds of a life well lived. Thomas Riker eventually sold his holdings and moved to Texas, defeated by a combination of bad luck and the unified front of ranchers he'd once intimidated. Ethan bought some of his land, consolidating his position as one of the most influential men in the territory. But he never forgot the lessons Teresa had taught him. That success meant nothing without love, that being remembered mattered more than being rich, that the small moments, the everyday interactions, were what made a life worth living. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Ethan took Teresa back to the spot where he'd proposed. The children were with Mrs. Chen for the evening, giving them rare time alone. They stood watching the sunset, just as they had a decade earlier, and Ethan marveled at how much had changed. "Do you remember what you said when you first arrived in Enid?" he asked. "I said a lot of things," Teresa replied, leaning into his embrace. "Which thing are you remembering?" "You whispered that you would never be remembered," Ethan said, "that nobody would notice if you disappeared." Teresa was quiet for a moment. "I remember feeling that way. It seems like another lifetime ago, like it happened to a different person." "It did, in a way," Ethan said. "That was a woman who was lost and hurting and convinced she did not matter. But this woman, my wife, the mother of my children, she matters. She is remembered every single day by her family who loves her, by the town that respects her, by me, who falls in love with her all over again every morning." "You remember everything about me," Teresa said softly, echoing his words from their wedding day. "I do," Ethan confirmed. "I remember the scared woman who collapsed on Main Street, the brave one who stood up to Thomas Riker, the loving mother who sings our children to sleep, the passionate wife who still makes my heart race. I remember all of it, Teresa, every version of you, because you are impossible to forget." Teresa turned in his arms, tears shining in her eyes. "I was so lost when I found you. I thought my life was over, that I had nothing left to live for. But you saw something in me I could not see in myself. You remembered me into existence." "No," Ethan corrected gently. "You were always there, always strong and brave and wonderful. I just had the privilege of witnessing it, of building a life with you." They kissed as the sun set, two people who'd found each other against all odds and built something lasting. And as they stood there, Ethan sent up a silent prayer of thanks for the day a woman had stumbled into Enid with nothing but grief and determination, and somehow become his everything. The children were 10, 8, and 5 when Oklahoma became a state in 1907. Joseph was already showing signs of becoming a rancher like his father, spending every free moment with the cattle and horses. Catherine was bookish and thoughtful, always reading or writing stories. Samuel was the wild one, full of energy and mischief that kept Teresa on her toes. Ethan and Teresa watched them grow with pride and wonder, marveling at the people they were becoming. On quiet evenings after the children were in bed, they would sit on the porch and talk about the future. "Joseph will take over the ranch someday," Ethan predicted. "He has the same passion for it I did at his age." "And Catherine will be a writer," Teresa added. "Mark my words, that girl is going to do something significant with those stories she is always creating." "What about Samuel?" "Samuel is going to give us gray hair," Teresa said with a laugh. "But he will find his path. They all will." Ethan pulled her close, content in a way he'd never imagined possible. "We did good, did we not? Built a good life." "We did," Teresa agreed. "We built a life worth remembering." And it was. Through the years that followed, through challenges and triumphs, sickness and health, they continued to build. Their love deepened, settling into something comfortable and enduring. They grew old together, watching their children have children, building a legacy that stretched far beyond cattle and land. When Ethan was 65, his hair more silver than blonde and his hands marked with the work of a lifetime, he sat on the porch and thought about the journey. 43 years since he'd come to Oklahoma territory with nothing. 33 years since Teresa had walked into his life. Decades of building and loving and living fully. Teresa joined him, moving a little slower now but still beautiful to him. Her hair was white, her face lined, but her green eyes still sparkled with the same spirit that had first captivated him. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, settling into the chair beside his. "Remembering," Ethan replied. "The day we met. The way you looked collapsing in the street. How I knew immediately that you were going to change my life." "I changed it that much," Teresa teased gently. "You gave it meaning," Ethan said seriously. "Before you, I was just going through motions, building something because I did not know what else to do. But you taught me what it meant to really live, to love, to remember what matters." Teresa reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "You taught me I was worth remembering, that I mattered. I will never forget that gift, Ethan. Never." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set over the prairie, two people who'd found each other when they'd both needed it most. The house behind them was full of family, gathered for Sunday dinner. Grandchildren ran through the yard, their laughter carried on the evening breeze. The ranch stretched out around them, prosperous and secure. "No regrets?" Ethan asked. "Not a single one," Teresa replied. "This life we built, it is everything I never knew I wanted. You are everything I never knew I needed." "I love you," Ethan said, the same words he'd spoken thousands of times over their decades together. "I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "I know," Teresa said simply. "And I love you the same. Always have, always will." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they remained there together, remembering. Remembering the moment they met, the battles they'd fought, the life they'd built. Remembering the love that had sustained them through everything, the love that would outlast even death itself. because some things were impossible to forget, and their love was one of them. Years continued to pass, bringing both joy and sorrow, as such is the nature of life. They lost Mrs. Chen to old age when she was 87, mourning the woman who'd been part of their family for decades. Martha Sinclair passed away at 93, stubborn and opinionated until the very end. But there were celebrations too. Joseph married a wonderful woman named Anne and took over management of the ranch. Catherine published her first novel at 28, dedicating it to her mother, who taught me what it means to be strong. Samuel, after a few wild years, became a veterinarian and settled down with a schoolteacher named Rebecca. The grandchildren came, 9 in total, filling the ranch with new life. Ethan and Teresa loved watching them grow, seeing pieces of themselves reflected in the younger generations. They told stories of the old days, of how they'd met and fallen in love and built something lasting. "Tell us again about when grandmother stood up to the bad man," one grandchild would inevitably ask, and Teresa would smile and recount the story of facing down Thomas Riker. The tale had grown somewhat in the telling, but the core remained true. She had found her courage, her voice, her sense of self-worth in that confrontation. Ethan, for his part, told stories about the early days of the ranch, about building from nothing, about taking chances, about the importance of standing up for what you believed in. But his favorite stories were always about Teresa, about the day she'd arrived in Enid and changed everything. When Ethan was 72, his heart finally began to fail. The doctor said it was simply age, the inevitable wearing down of a body that had worked hard for 7 decades. Teresa nursed him through it with fierce devotion, refusing to consider a world without him in it. "You are not leaving me," she insisted one night when his breathing was particularly labored. "We have a deal, remember? We face everything together." "Teresa," Ethan said, his voice weak but his eyes clear, "we have had 38 years, beautiful, perfect years. If it ends now, I have no complaints." "Well, I do," she said fiercely, tears streaming down her face. "I need more time, more years, more moments. I am not ready to let you go." Ethan pulled her down beside him on the bed, holding her as best he could. "Then I will fight," he promised. "For you I will fight." And he did. Against all odds, Ethan rallied. Within weeks, he was back on his feet, weaker than before but alive. The doctor called it a miracle. Ethan knew it was Teresa, her will and love and refusal to give up keeping him tethered to life. They celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary surrounded by family, a testament to everything they'd built together. Looking around at their children and grandchildren at the ranch that had grown beyond anything he'd imagined, Ethan felt a profound sense of completion. "We did it," he said to Teresa as they danced, slowly and carefully but still dancing. "We built a legacy." "We built a love story," Teresa corrected. "Everything else was just a bonus." She was right, as she so often was. The ranch, the success, even the family they adored, all of it was secondary to the love they shared. That was the foundation, the core, the thing that made everything else possible. Ethan died peacefully in his sleep at 76, Teresa beside him as she'd been for 4 decades. His last conscious words were, "I remember everything. I remember it all." Teresa grieved as anyone would grieve the loss of their heart. But she did not fall apart the way she had after Daniel's death, because this time she knew who she was. Ethan had given her that gift, helping her become a woman who knew her own worth, who understood she mattered. She lived another 8 years after his death, watching their grandchildren become adults, welcoming great-grandchildren into the world. She wrote down all the stories, wanting to preserve the history of their love for future generations. She remained active in the community, still fierce and opinionated and impossible to ignore. And when she finally joined Ethan, passing peacefully at 84, she did so with a smile on her face. Her last words, spoken to Joseph, who sat vigil beside her, were simple: "Tell them we loved well." They buried her next to Ethan on the highest point of the ranch, the spot where he'd proposed all those years ago. The headstone was simple: Teresa Everhart, Irving, 1868–1918, beloved wife, mother, grandmother. She was remembered, and she was, profoundly and completely. For generations after, the family told stories of Ethan and Teresa, of how they'd met and fallen in love against all odds, of how she'd arrived broken and convinced she was forgettable, and he'd seen her, really seen her, and remembered everything about her. Their love story became legend in the family, passed down through the decades as an example of what real love looked like. Not perfect, not without challenges, but enduring, true. A love that transformed both people involved, making them better than they'd been alone. The ranch remained in the family for over 100 years, each generation adding their own chapter to the story. But at the heart of it all was always Ethan and Teresa, the rancher and the widow who'd found each other in a dusty Oklahoma town and built something that lasted far beyond their own lives. Because some love stories are too powerful to forget. Some people leave marks so deep that they echo through generations. And Teresa Everhart Irving, who'd once whispered that she'd never be remembered, became one of the most remembered women in her family's history, not for wealth or fame or any grand achievement, but for love, for courage, for the simple, profound act of being fully and completely herself, and for finding a man who saw that self, remembered every detail, and loved her with everything he had until his last breath. In the end, that was the greatest legacy of all.